Bloodborne is, as we all know, brilliant, but I think it's a little bit blemished. Bloodborne has a mysterious effect on people. It's stranger than HP's nightmare dreams. Its grip on gamers' psyches is as forceful as the pull of the moon on Yharnam. Love for the craft has remained steady throughout the age. A hunter must hunt, and the night is long. 10 years long as we speak. If the game only remained playable on a PlayStation console, most of you would stay forever. But do you remain because you care that much, or are you just trapped in a fever dream? And a deeper question, is it really love if you want to change it? Both the blessing and the curse of Bloodborne and all of its wonders and woes is not what it could have been, but what always was. Are Bloodborne's most die-hard enjoyers just madmen, or is this bloody gem from 2015 truly a masterpiece? Whatever that word means anymore. Let us try to express what words cannot, through gameplay analysis. After all, it's not like Bloodborne is known for its words to begin with. But seriously, I'll have a lot to say about this game, and not just words to suck it off. The FromSoft fanboys have done enough of that themselves. It's okay to love what you love. Just make sure it's for the right reasons, because you see something that's actually there and not just what you've been told exists. Because when you look away from something, things might not be as you remember them. It's easy to equate Bloodborne with completion when it works so simply, yet is so masterful at doing what it sets out to do. But can something be a singular masterpiece in a genre that itself is incomplete and imperfect? Ironically, the game so many Souls loyalists claim to be the best was the one that broke away from their unorthodox jumble of build-based combat patented in Demon Souls into more formalized territory of the skill-based kind. It's the turning point in FromSoft's history where they, and Japan's studio, doubled down on the action RPG formula, with emphasis on the action, increased pacing, and speed. Gone was the build variety and emergent gameplay properties of the original Souls into a more straightforward, melee-focused frenzy. It's the formal, curated style of play, where you have very little variety in the ways that you operate, yet because of the repetition of it all, you're tricked into thinking that mastery is inherent. It's one thing to play efficiently in a game like Bloodborne and feel satisfied at doing so, but experiencing true depth here requires little more than memorization skills. As one of my fellow YouTubers put it in her review of Neo and Bloodborne side by side, the skill ceiling in Bloodborne is low and you're on a trampoline. Those are her words, not mine, but I think she said it best. Action RPGs are known for their restrictions, for pulling their punches in favor of big wind-ups. Typically, these games function more based on timing and precision than intuitive fluidity. As elaborate as many of the large-scale battles look from the outside, the actual mechanics of Bloodborne can be reduced primarily to the standard alternation between strong and weak attacks, regulated by the stamina meter, meaning all the theatrics and hysterics of these oversized hitboxes is mostly just for show, because there's not too much else you can do with them. At least when looking at the base game, the fights rarely shift dynamics beyond sidestepping a big wind-up to come in for some pot shots. There are some light RPG elements here beyond the stat stuffing, like the blood gem slots and runes, but again, nothing in particular that fundamentally alters the play, just the numbers go up shtick. However, there are a few ideas snuck in here that don't draw huge attention to themselves that do make for the type of unique game design that more games should have. Techniques that do make Bloodborne memorable for more than just the ambience. Along with eschewing most of the needless RPG fluff, Bloodborne puts the player directly in the shoes of a particular archetype of character, the hunter. And almost every make and model of hunter is some kind of spooky doohickey that you can cut down a giant werewolf with, and a gun. The gun parry is flashy and easily exploitable against most bosses, but the criticism here is that guns don't really have much utility outside of being riposte tools, and you can waste a ton of ammo attempting the parry just to come up short. In a sense, it's somewhere in between a last resort and a technique that can be trusty with the right timing and patience. It's good to have for sure, but it's not exactly a mechanic that you have to master in order to get good at the game. I'm one of the players that really let it go unappreciated the first time I was playing, and now I have to admit that it's a fun feature of the offense that whenever you pull it off, strikes a good balance between a useful technique and not so much a crutch or a gimmick. Of course, Sekiro is great for how it handles an entire game based on parries, but most games should never just put the entire focus on one style of play, and it's good that Bloodborne has a little something extra than just hacking and slashing. The rally mechanic is another excellent idea, at least for the casual play, as it allows the player to stay up close and personal and put pressure onto the boss at all times. It's a fantastic design choice because it facilitates and actively awards aggression, though it doesn't matter all that much when you can just as easily stay behind most bosses and not get hit anyway. But it's a great idea for general purpose gameplay and just less important for higher levels of play in which you'd never think of getting hit regardless. Something like what Wolong did by giving you increased attack power by successive hits might have been even better, but this still encourages all players to fight with confidence and poise. It's one of the unique ideas that can't be disputed as an attempted innovation. It's the one mechanic that actually stands out as truly altering the combat dynamic. For all of the talk of trick weapons and their flashy gimmicks, the actual utility of them is questionable. Most of the transformations do chip damage at best, at the potential cost of high recovery frames on the player. You don't exactly get to count these as combo strings when they provide nothing in the way of additional hit stun or attack chaining. Consider that a game like Nioh 2, which came out a few years later in the wake of Bloodborne and DS3, shifting the subgenre closer to the action side of things. Nioh also has trick weapons in the form of stances, and that, in addition to more fluid and seamless transitions and phase shifts, you get additional combos depending on the form your weapon takes. And now is a good time to denounce another pointless feature that Bloodborne implements that was also improved in Nioh, the weapon durability. In Nioh, rather than being punished for using the same weapon over and over again, you get a reward called the familiarity bonus. By building up hits with a weapon or by wearing armor and accessories, your gauge fills to the max, at which point you earn additional damage and protection stats for the item permanently, as well as some status bonuses for limited durations. And what does Bloodborne do? It lets your shit break in the middle of a fight, so you have to fast travel back to the Hunter's Dream just to spend some blood echoes needlessly. It's a pointless mechanic in the grand scheme of things, but this is also the game that has the insight mechanic that secretly adjusts the game's difficulty in ways that you'd have to really look into in order to notice. There are some design quirks that don't make perfect sense, but we deal with them because the core is still firm. And at the very center of Bloodborne are the bosses, the main course in these games. And they are good, if not basic, with greater emphasis on their beauty than their battle mechanics. Bloodborne's bosses, generally speaking, are memorable more for their appearances and their shrieks than they are for the way they make you dance. Like a lot of things in Bloodborne, the boss fights get a little too much credit, which is really owed more to the atmosphere. The hunter fights are interesting in the sense that they handle mechanically similar to the way the player functions, so it's always a test of skill, and the obvious pattern looping that is usually exploited with these types of doppelganger enemies in games. Really, the only variety here depends on the choice of weapon they use at the time, unless you get invaded in PvP, in which you'll have an annoying time facing off against an invader that will never die but will give you some laughs. Though the boss fights are not especially dynamic in the way you engage with them, they each have some distinct dynamic that presents a unique challenge to you. Perhaps the fan favorite from the base game is Vicar Amelia's healing opportunity, keeping you on your toes at all times, preventing you from running down the clock, which you should never be encouraged to do in this game anyway. You have Father G's phase shift that really elevates the introductory gatekeeper, as does the triple shadow fight that operates more like a puzzle and a lesson in micromanagement. You gotta give it credit for being somewhat calibrated, balancing for fluidity, with good pacing in between the long range and close quarters attacks, having a shared health bar that you have to manage independently in chunks. But for every interesting fight, there's a counterpart that's more of a chore, as well as a number of gimmick fights like the one Reborn and the Witches of Hemwick, and of course, Rom's gank fight for all of the arachnophobes out there. Then there's the infamous Mikotash, an intentionally irritating distraction that runs and fights like a pussy bitch. It's the DLC where it is often thought to be the saving grace in these games, and for Bloodborne, it does help to elevate the mood a little bit with some of the series' most fun and memorable challenges and weapons, like the pizza cutter, and bosses like Ludwig and Lawrence. Like most of the Souls games, the main story bosses are breezy so that the average player can bypass the challenge and continue the game to its conclusion. It's a bit redundant, as always, to put so much emphasis in a combat-oriented game on boss encounters, only for a good portion of them to be basic and forgettable. It's also just a standard criticism that bosses can only be rematched in New Game Plus, in which case much of the unwanted traversal through meandering places like the Forbidden Woods becomes unnecessary. Sekiro did better by making it accessible to simply replay the boss fights, and Elden Ring went out of its way to duplicate bosses throughout a single playthrough. But I suppose I'm neglecting to consider the Chalice dungeons and their custom degree of difficulty, which can be done through co-op, customized by shareable glyphs, and are generally replayable to an extent. The farming for the materials is still a pain in the ass, though. I'm someone that likes to beat these games in the highest New Game Plus possible, and that trend started with Bloodborne, which I beat something like 8 or 9 times, including the DLC for the first time recently on New Game Plus, whatever it was. It's a game that I always admired for its replayability relative to its initial runtime. It's a game that might take you 50 hours to do everything in the first time, but one that you can speedrun through with ease every other time. It's just too bad that the fast traveling and the co-op are both still slow and shitty. There's one thing that Bloodborne does that holds up well. In fact, it's something FromSoft has done in all of their games that all games should take more note of these days, which is not letting the story get in the way of the gameplay or vice versa. Bloodborne breaks a rule of storytelling, and so do most of the early From Software games, in their cryptic form of exposition dumps. That is, to tell, not show. Normally, you're supposed to show, not tell, the story to the viewer. This is so you can communicate the subtext directly and let the audience use their emotional intelligence to determine how they feel about it. The defense for this is that by keeping the story ambiguous and optional, it doesn't bog the runtime down with unskippable cutscenes. Except that skippable cutscenes do exist and have more action and answers packed in than the breadcrumbs that FromSoft leaves for you, and the side dishes scattered in the semi-open world. The semi-story actually would end up taking more of your time out of the playable experience than the standard 2-hour cutscene montages in other games do, because you have to be a detective reading through the countless item descriptions for backstory instead of the organic character development through live means. But a game is a game, and a hunter must hunt, and although I thought it a minor criticism years ago, I now accept that FromSoft's unique approach to story is right for their goals and right for the medium. It's a unique game that you can have absolutely no idea what anything means and still be in awe. 5 years ago, I remarked in a video listing my 10 best games on the PS4 lifecycle that perhaps no other game of the generation had cast a shadow as large as Bloodborne. I was a fan of the game then, albeit a skeptical one of its masterpiece status, and I remain a fan now. But fast forward 10 years from the midpoint of the last decade, and games like Bloodborne have been demystified, at least a bit, and I can already hear the crying from the comments. But consider that the now standard practice of waiting for big windups to counter with chip damage windows can be found in many such derivative games. There's nothing quite like a pure action game that can ever be demystified. Not a Devil May Cry, not a Ninja Gaiden, not a Bayonetta. Nioh will never have an equal. Hence, we identify the main problem of the last decade in gaming to be oversaturation. An own genre has been poached and plagiarized as frequently as the Souls games in the way that they've been transmogrified into the now ill-fated and soul-sucked Souls-likes. The issue is that action RPGs influenced by Bloodborne and games like Dark Souls 3 have developed an identity crisis on whether to be more parts action or more sufficiently RPG. To the extent that the pure Souls games have depth, it's an identity crisis between formal and experimental gameplay, which causes friction between the systems because of one making the other redundant to a degree. A sort of jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none dynamic, which is a cliche expression, but how else can you describe the problem? The reason that action game purists such as myself prefer the old school action games from the arcade lineage is that they are fine-tuned and fit for the combat sandbox. There's a degree of that in the original Souls and in Elden Ring, but here on Bloodborne we simply have a very well-made game that doesn't do a whole lot to truly innovate. For decades, the preeminent hack-and-slash action RPG was Blizzard's Diablo series, with its very simplistic top-down spam fest punctuated by the numbers going up. It's a game of multiplication and not mechanical mastery. But then Team Ninja decided to help rectify the problem by making Neo, a decades-in-the-making passion project that finally fit the bill for a game that was sufficiently action through its emphasis on combo strings and constant offensive tools, and as an RPG with a multitude of systems that tie together and increase not only build proficiency, but build variety. The defense of apples and oranges doesn't quite work here, because this isn't really a case of apples and oranges as much as it is a case of one piece of fruit peeling back more layers than it should from the classic action blueprints. In Bloodborne's case, there's no jump button, there's no dedicated healing source, there's no block. It's like saying that Black Myth Wukong is a masterpiece because it has a very restrictive gimmick that it wants you to master. You don't generally get to make an inferior product and claim the defense of it being different but equal. That's not how good designs work. Action games are fundamentally about equilibrium and balance mechanics. For instance, what you can do versus what the boss can do, like I discussed briefly in praising the hunter fights to an extent. But at a certain point, things shifted to making the player feel like the boss in a game like Neo, and taking off the restrictions so that you could be more expressive like in Elden Ring. What I resented the Souls games for doing was curating the playstyles to be more limiting and not fully embracing the power structure of either genre. If you're going to have an action RPG, make it in 3D and make it something like Neo or Elden Ring. Or just make a standard hack and slash game and give me a jump button. Even the modern day action RPGs are starting to bring that feature back. But in truth, Bloodborne is still a great game, a unique game for its aesthetic among the AI-infested landscape and the uninspired photorealism of the day. And as an action game, it scratches a particular itch that I'm fine to rub at 30 FPS for as long as it takes. In the era of remakes and forced homogeneity, Bloodborne is one of the games I'm glad won't see a remake anytime soon, because it definitely doesn't need one, no matter how many fanboys cry out for one. If it's really the game that you love, it's the game that you accept for what it is. FromSoft's design evolution, expressed through their games, is all part of a handcrafted, interconnected universe. Each game a stepping stone and a learning experience on the way to Elden Ring, the real masterpiece, at least for me and a lot of other people. Bloodborne, like the genre itself, whether we go by the titular Souls or the true designator action RPG, is simply one part of a whole. It's a great genre that needs to slow down a little and work on more unique experimental design, like what FromSoft has tried to do with each successive sequel. For the longest time, no one thought they'd ever catch FromSoft, and unless your name is Team Ninja, you probably won't. This has been the Commissioner of Games. Good night, God bless, good games, and goodbye. This is the Commissioner of Games, signing off.
I got a missile! Watch out! Lord Akbar!
Fuck him up.
We're bullying him!